All right, and good evening, and thanks so much for everybody for joining the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. We're super excited today to have Jocel come here and talk to us about Microsoft Graph. Certainly, we're going to learn and get our maneuvering our way through Microsoft Graph, and take it away.
First, thanks everyone for coming tonight. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So tonight's topic is going to be maneuvering your way to Microsoft Graph API. But before we're going to get into the details of my slides, let me just introduce myself. Name's Jocel Sabellano. I write automations in PowerShell. And you can check me in GitHub /the ITRX. I am a senior systems engineer that's based here in Chicago. So tonight's agenda, we're going to be talking a brief overview of what is Microsoft Graph API, and then the benefits of knowing Graph, and then what applications or automations can you make with it. And then the bulk of the session is going to be how to authenticate the Graph API. So we're going to talk about the different grant types, and requesting a token, and then sending those access token to Graph API. I decided to go for more on the authentication part because a lot of the confusion with Graph is coming from the authentication and how to have a valid access token. So what is Microsoft Graph? It is a REST API, a unified endpoint that gives you access to Azure AD, Excel, Intune, Outlook, OneDrive, SharePoint, Planner, and there's a lot of more. So pretty much anything that's virtually anything that's within the umbrella of Microsoft 365, you can access those resources through Graph API. And then from those access, you can generate reports and audit data, perform hundreds and hundreds of tasks programmatically, and then you can build a lot of automations or apps, and yeah, just be awesome with it. So why is Microsoft Graph important? What you can do with it is you can onboard users. You can automate the onboarding of your users. You can integrate with Excel, so you can tap into Excel API endpoint, and then just automate your workflows. You can manage employee profiles, and then you can manage Intune and Autopilot, correlate security events, and then grab a ton of reporting data, insights, and analytics. Two of my favorites are the correlation of events, and then reporting and insights and analytics. In fact, last project I had with Graph API was creating automatic tickets for all the security alerts in all of our customers' Office 365 environment. So yeah, that's really good. So some numbers about Microsoft Graph. 90% of all Fortune 500 companies have data in Microsoft Graph. A lot. 100 billion Microsoft Graph requests every month. Then 18 terabytes of data. That includes emails, events, users, files, groups, and more. And then 180 million monthly active users for Microsoft 365. That's a ton of number, right? So I guess that's enough reason to really learn Graph, especially if your environment or you're in the type of work you do, you're exposed to Microsoft 365. All right, so let's get into authentication. Before I uh, dive into the details of it, I would like to have just small differentiation between the conventional way of authenticating to remote servers versus Graph API. So conventionally, um, you would need to have a username and password, put in a credential object, and then stitch that to your commandlet, and then forward over to the remote server, right? That's a two-legged setup, simple and straightforward. If your username and password is right, and if you have the right permissions, then you get what you need, right? With Graph API, you're going to be dealing with a three-legged setup. First leg is yourself as the client, and then the authentication server, and then so you're going to be forwarding a bunch of information to the authentication server. For example, your service principal, the application ID, secret, and a bunch of other stuff, which we're going to be dealing in a bit. And then once everything's good, you get your access token. Now, what are you going to do with your access token? you're gonna send that over to the application server or the Graph API endpoint. So it's pretty much like, when you go into an arcade, go to the counter, pay, get the token, and then go to the whatever game you want to play, right? And just pop in the token. Similar to that. I'd like to point out that the your communication, once you have an access token, the process is pretty much uniform. And in terms of in terms of sending it over to the Graph API endpoint, the difference may only be like some parameters and some information that you need to put over to attach your request. But in terms of the accessing or acquiring access token, there's a lot of ways, depending on where you deploy your application or the circumstances of your script. Um, there's a lot of ways on how to acquire a token, and like I said earlier, that's when the confusion comes in, and we're gonna try to demystify that confusion tonight. So um, there's like three major components when you connect to Graph API. First is you're gonna have a service principal in Azure, or some people call it Azure application, or Azure app. And then so from the Azure app, or from the service principal, you get an application ID and secret, and then your tenant ID, and then you assign permissions to it, and then you consent your permission, or an admin needs to consent your permission. And then your AD credentials, you stitch them together, form into an object, and then you send them over to the access token endpoint, right? And once you get an access token endpoint, like I said, you send it over to the Graph API endpoint. Now, currently, there are two root URLs for the Graph API, beta endpoint and the version 1. And then the format for the URL is graph.microsoft.com/version /resource ID property, and then a bunch of query parameters that you can put into your URL. So let me talk more about the service principal. It's let me just instead of putting in a slide, let me get into my Azure AD tenant here. So when you're in your Azure, and then you go to Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and then you go to app registrations, pretty much you register a new application. And since I already done that, I'm just going to open up the the properties for my Azure app here. Here you can find your application ID. And right now, just focus on like the information that I'm pointing out here, and we're gonna get into like how we can stitch them together later on. And then you get the tenant ID, and then that's what you will need, and then your API permissions. So you get permissions over. So the current permission for this app is to read, directory read all into my environment, right? And then
So,
the
hey, Jocel.
secrets. Yep.
So let's just back up for people that may have never seen this before. So you're making an app. You're simply starting up an app. All those IDs that you had there, those are all assigned by Microsoft, which you then can use later. So creating an app is simple as just firing it and saying I want to fire a new app, right?
Yep. And then you just go through. You fill out a bunch of information. And then yeah, pretty much.
So,
Yes.
so it's
Nothing
really
so
simple.
special.
Yeah, really simple to get started. After it's instantiated, then you can take that information and pass that information on to newer things.
Right. Yeah. So these are the things that it would ask you. The redirect URL. Yep. And then if you want to just go for an application just within your tenant, or an application that will work for your tenant. So pretty much, I think an analogy here is your service principal or your Azure app is like a logical folder for your application or for your script. And later on, we're gonna be able to understand why you would need to have a a service principal. And this approach is based off OAuth 2, which is an industry standard for for a lot of REST APIs, not just Graph API. So learning OAuth 2, or like all these methods, you'd be able to benefit from it, not just by learning Graph API, but as well as when you talk to Facebook APIs, other REST APIs.
And
So
this is,
effectively, oh, go ahead, Mike.
and I was just going to say, Phil, I'm sorry. This is if you're building an app from scratch. If you're
True.
trying to connect to an app that Microsoft has already set up the connectors for, you basically want to say, hey, I want to use an app like Concur, and I just want to put in my information about Concur. And then Microsoft has already made the backend connections to get to Concur for you. Right?
Oh, well, right. But if you are making your own script, you would need to create something on your own. Right? So
So
because
effectively,
whatever they're making, you don't have access to that.
so what really you're talking about, the service principal, is this object, it's this construct. Now that construct has a credential that we kind of talked about before, but it has your tenant, it has the app that you're connecting to, and you said the permissions, you assign permissions to that potential service principal and all of that kind of stuff. So the service principal is the thing that you're going to be doing. Now it is an app, it is a bunch of other stuff. It is the tenant, it is the subscription, it is your user
Right.
ID, it is your connection. It is an API token, potentially a
Right.
key, and then that's your service principal. And then
Right.
later on, you then hand that to an authenticator, which then comes back and says, "Now I have a token." That's what we got to before, right?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
am I understanding that right? So I just wanted to
Sure.
reword
Yep.
what you just said.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Right about it. So you consent the app. So you authenticate to the app, and then you consent it, and then you get a token, and then on your future request, you're no longer going to be providing your username and password, but it's just going to be the app that represents you to access Graph API resources.
Yeah, and so that
Yep.
principal would be unique to that app on that tenant with
Yep.
that permissions. And so
Mhm.
if you needed to do a different permission set or a different app, then it would be, again, in the same tenant. It would just be a new service principal with a new token, and there'd be two discrete objects.
Right.
Cool.
Okay. Cool. All right. So yeah, going back to my app here, I do have a secret. Yep, here. So you could generate a couple of secrets for different purposes, but yeah. All right. So yeah, pretty much these are the information that you would need from your service principal. Permissions, and then the consent, and yeah, your credentials. So let's talk briefly about permissions. You can assign two kinds of permissions: delegated and application. So if you are to request, if you are to talk to Graph API and needs, say for example, you want to send an email, Graph API would need to have a user context within your access token, right? So from there, you can tell what kind of permission that you would need, either a delegated or application permission. With delegated permission, you would need to have this if you need to have an access or like a user in your access token. And if you don't need to have a user context in your access token, you would go for application. So, to demonstrate that quickly, if you go to API permissions, and then when you add a permission, and then you go to Microsoft Graph, and then you get two kinds of permissions here. So it's pretty much like you ask your question, like, hey, do I need to have a user associated to this? Yeah, so you go to delegate permissions. But if you don't need to have a user, then yeah, you just go for application permissions. Examples of endpoints that don't need user context in the access token are, say, reporting endpoints. Yeah, reporting and audits and stuff like that. Examples of endpoints that need user context are, like, say you want to send a message to Teams, right, or send an email and that kind of stuff. So now you got your permissions, but that's just not enough. You need also to consent, right? So you're granting permissions to the service principal to gain access to your email, right? But that's not enough. You're gonna need to consent it, explicitly consent it, to let it access to your email, or to let it access to your tenant's directory data, right? The way how you would do that is, you just pass these parameters into URL, and then depending on like the program that you're using, with PowerShell, there's forms that you could do to access this URL, and then you authenticate. And I think all of us that have at least have access to Microsoft apps before are familiar with this screenshot over here. So in this case, I'm consenting this app to read identity risk event information in my tenant. And there are some permissions as well that where it's not enough to just consent, or it's not enough for a user to consent. It needs to have admin consent. So this is how you would do it. The URL for this is pretty much straightforward. All right, so
Jocel, where do you find those URLs at?
it's in the documentation. I do. In a bit. I'm going to show you where in the docs.microsoft.com you can find these URLs. Yeah. So now you get the service principal, you get the permissions, you get the consent, right? So you're pretty much ready to send this over to the access to request for an access token, right? So, but before we get an access token, I'd like to talk about the structure of the access token here. So this is an example of an access token. It's an encoded string, and then when decoded, it translates into like a bunch of information. I'm not sure if it's visible here, but let me try to here. So this is an example of an access token, and then like I said, if decoded, it gives you like the expiration. So meaning you can't use this access token if it's past the expiration time, and then the user associated to it. Yeah. And then depending on the access token, right now this access token doesn't have any permission or scope assigned to it. So yeah, it's JWT or JSON Web Token. And then the endpoint to the request, or the URL to request a token, is login at microsoftonline.com, and then you put the tenant ID, and then OAuth 2 version 2.0, and then token. Let's get that into action. Here I got a working code.
All right. So before you get to your code, I just want to make sure, because there's some chatter in the chat, and this is a topic that I think people are very interested in, but also can be confusing to some people. So there's some people that have been asking questions. Rather than go through the particular, I'd like to ask people, is there anybody who needs another walkthrough on what we've done or is unsure of what we've covered so far? Because this is like foundational. So guys, if you have a question, please open up your mic and ask before Jocel starts to move on to the stuff. I don't want people to feel lost.
Yeah, feel free to ask questions, please.
Yeah. So Robert's asking, can you delegate less permissions than giving someone complete access to Azure AD? And I think the answer to that is yes.
Yep.
If you want to work with users, you need permissions. So there's some basic questions that the group has been handling, but I just want to make sure before we let Jocel rip on the examples that we understand the foundational knowledge of apps, the information that's available, and what he's going to start piecing together. If everybody's okay with that, which no one seems to be saying anything, Jocel, keep knocking it out, man. You're doing awesome.
So I had the question really is, so the URLs we were talking about is that a lot of that information is, I think it's in some of that code there, but you get that you need to get these URIs with the pieces, but you get them externally to that. So you're not using the web interface at all. You're not using the admin consoles at all, the portal itself. You're just using that to get some keys and some pieces of information to then come in here and create this script, as you kind of saw. And so some of those URLs that you were showing and that Jeremy was asking questions about, all of that is in the documentation in order to build your script, so then you could then do other work. So is that a good recap there?
Yeah, so all these information over here, before I proceed, I'd like to point out that there's certainly, don't do this at home or like on your own code. I'm putting these secrets here in my variable just for the simplicity of my demo.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer your question, So I grabbed this information from the screenshot or from my page over here, right? So you created a service principal, and then you pretty much just copy and paste it from the overview.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a
And
quick
then
summary of what we
Mhm.
did already is you have an Azure subscription, you with an Azure AD tenant, you log in, you create an app registration.
Mm-hmm.
The app registration is what gives you your secret and allows you to consent for whatever permissions you attribute to the app registration.
Right.
And then we're going to use that app registration information. So that's what the client ID is. The client ID
Right.
is part of that app registration. The
Mm-hmm.
tenant ID is the tenant to your Azure Active Directory, and the secret is essentially the password for the quote unquote user that is the app registration, which
Yep.
is what you
The
assign your
service
permissions
principal.
to.
Yep. Yep. Pretty
Okay.
much.
And then the last thing I want to say
Is
is,
that a
can we make that
decent
bigger?
summary?
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate summary.
And that's better. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So here is, like I said, I pretty much just got, took all these information, and I made a hash table. And this is this is my preferred method to stitch all these information together. And then, the grant type, I'm going to talk about this in a bit. You're going to have to specify that it's client credentials, and then the scope, and then the client ID. And then if I run this, so yeah, let me show you what's the structure of my token body. This is pretty much my token body. And now the response of my um, token request. So I have an access token over here. Right. Now, like I mentioned on a three-legged setup, I go ahead and create a new hash table, and I pretty much, in my example over here, I'm gonna go ahead and grab all the users in my directory. If I just run this, now I have the header of my request, and send it over. There you go. So I got all of my users over here.
So at this
And
point, is that this is the sec. So you kind of talked about like the three-legged authentication. So you use the token request, token request res there, which was the token to get this token, and then from now on, in order to talk to or to use
yeah,
to talk to graph, and that's the line 36 there, is in order to get some more data or to do other work and all that kind of stuff, you have to pass in that bearer token and that
right.
authorization key.
Every time you
Mhm.
talk to Graph, you're gonna have to. Yeah, you don't have to go through accessing a new token. Yeah, that's a really good question. So tokens by default are valid for 1 hour, right? And I know you're gonna ask me like, what? Are you telling me I'm gonna have to re-authenticate, or gonna have to like acquire a token every hour? Not, but I'm gonna have to explain to that in my future slides. And I'm gonna get into that in a bit. Questions so far on how stitching all this information together work?
No, I think we're pretty good.
All right. So, all right. So I got an access token. How do I know which endpoint, or like, if I need to upload files into my OneDrive, how do I know? Right. So, a very good starting point is going to, eh, yeah, docs.microsoft.com/graph/overview. And then this is where you can get started with things. In fact, one of the sub menus over here is where you can find the token access token URL. And then I would usually go to say, for example, if I want to go to reports, right? Um, so let's say, okay, I want to know how um how my users are, like, what are my numbers as far as exchange traffic in my network, right? So I go reports, and I go, say Outlook, and then get activity counts, or reports, get activity count. And then from here, it tells you, all right, so what's the permission you would need to be able to have this access token, or to be able to query into this endpoint. Then it tells you the URL to get to it, right? And it tells you, sample or like the data that you're gonna be getting, then some, yeah. So now,
So when
we're
you were
pretty
doing
much,
the discovery, you were using that document in order to do it. So that's the place where we'd go and look for stuff.
yeah.
Okay.
And like I said earlier, once you have an access token, it's pretty much uniform in terms of talking to the Graph API endpoint. And I usually just search here, what I want to accomplish.
Yeah, it looks pretty extensive, so it looks pretty good.
Yeah, like SharePoint. There's a ton of stuff you can do over here. All right, so grant types. And like I mentioned earlier, depending on your circumstances or the circumstances of your automation, depending on where you deploy it, it is very important to know the different grant types, because it is how you can shape the way how your automation to behave to acquire an access token. So, to explain that further, for example, earlier, right? You notice in my access token request, I didn't put in a username and password in there, right? So that access token, I can't use that for me to be able to send an email, right? Or say, if you want to deploy your automation into like a headless machine, right? And then your user account needs to have multi-factor authentication, right? Now, if you need to do multi-factor authentication, obviously you need to open up a web GUI HTML-based form, put in your username and password, and go through the second factor authentication, right? Put in the MFA, OTP, whatever, right? So if you want to do it in a headless machine, how are you going to do that, right? Or I mentioned to you the access token is only valid for an hour, but how are we going to do it in such a way that you're not going to have to re-authenticate every hour, right? So there's there are different grant types that you can choose from, but these are the most common ones that are used, at least from what I've seen. And let me get into like the details for each one of that. For this guy, this is what I used in my last example, which is client credentials, and it's pretty straightforward. Just client credentials, client ID, and client secret. And again, you can't use this for talking to endpoints that need user context. Now, all right, so an extended version of it is password. So you're gonna be asking me like, yeah, okay, how do I go then for password? So there's password grant type. The thing though is, like, I need to mention this, that this is not recommended by Microsoft, because right now Microsoft's been pushing a multi-factor authentication, and since this guy doesn't doesn't support it, so it's not recommended by them. But the way how this thing works is it's pretty much close to the client credentials, but you just need to add a username and password to your request token body, and then for the grant type you change it to password, and then for the scope, specify the scope. Scope is like pretty much like the permission that you would need, right? So in my permission over here, I have directory read all, so I want my access token to be able to read all the directory in my directory resources in my tenant. And then for the offline access, this is for you to have a refresh token, and I'm gonna get into the refresh token in a bit. And again, please don't put your password and your secrets in your code. There's tons of guides out there on how you could encrypt your code, write it in a file, and then, or you could put it in a registry and then there are ways wherein it's only you, I guess, the user who could decrypt it. But there's tons of ways you could use, you know,
So Jocel,
or whatever. Yeah.
so Craig's got a question in the chat that's pretty
Mhm.
interesting, and maybe this is something you're about to get to. But he's curious, what's the difference between the token from 15 minutes ago and the token that you have now?
What the can you so if I have a same access token or different?
You refresh. Did you refresh the existing token, or did you get a new one generated?
I did not do any new one yet generated.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I had thought too.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted
So
to ask. And I
yeah,
wanted to
that's
see
a
if I
really
missed
good question. Look at this. So I have a token on my client credential here, and the difference would be, so this is my access token, right? So to tell difference, let's see here. Yeah, thanks for asking really good questions. I want to duplicate this. Right. So this is my access token from my first request, right? And then let me go for a password grant type, right? So I run this right here. Okay. And then now this is my new token for this new grant type. Let me copy and paste that and then decode it. So you just need to go to jwt.io and then paste this thing. Look at my token. I got a family name here. I got my name. I got the app, my IP address, and I got my school, right? So now, and I mentioned to you that your access token needs to have a user context in it. So Graph API endpoint reads, decodes this, this access token and reads this information, right? So now it knows, okay, the requester is this guy, test admin. Does that answer your question, Greg?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in my previous token, like, oh, I don't know who you are, and you're trying to send an email, all right? Denied. Yeah. Now, oh, get directory admin, and then you are Jocel. Yeah, you are a global admin, by the way. So yeah, you're in. Yeah, I almost forgot to mention that. So the effective permission for a user and the permission that you assigned to the service principal, it's always what takes precedence is the permission for that user. So if you're trying to have an access to like all of your directory data and then you're just like an average user, like a regular user, you don't have any global admin rights, can't do that, right? Because you just don't have permission to it. All right, so that's for the password. Okay, so yeah, now I have a really good, I have an awesome access token. So, oh, you know what? My all of the users in our Active Direct or in our Azure AD, everyone's enabled for multi-factor authentication, right? So what comes into play now is authorization code. So think of the authorization code as it's more of like a four-legged setup, because the way how it works is you authenticate, and then you authenticate and consent, and then you get a code. Now that code, you send it over along with those other information, vital information. You send it over to the access token request endpoint, and then from there you get a token, right? And then you get a token, you go to graph. So there's 4 steps instead of 3. And then for the first request, you just need to swing all these parameters to URL and then access this URL and then get yourself authenticated and then get a code again, like I said, and then request a token. So let me get that into action here. So this is a bit of a lengthy code, but I'll try to simplify it as much as I can after. So let me just run everything here first, and I'll explain to you what happens behind the curtain. So I run it. Now Internet Explorer opens. And then I just self-sign in. All right, so now I'm granting consent that, hey, read write all the groups. Then I accept it. All right, so in my Graph API request here, I made it to return me all of my groups. So what happened there was, let me run this, okay? Run that. Opens up Internet Explorer. Just pay attention to the URL, right? Sign in, and then accept. Pay attention to the URL. Look at this. Oops. I got a code. Now in my PowerShell script, I just need to capture this code. Let me put this in a notepad. All right. And all right, so I just need to capture this portion over here up into here, right? And in my PowerShell script, look at that. So I captured it from here. Then, right, and then yeah, this is my auth code. Now, how am I using that auth code? I put in here my grant type is authorization code, client ID and secret. Then my scope is all of these permissions over here. And the one different thing about this is you need to specify a redirect URI. So specifying a redirect URI is, so like earlier I had a redirect to Google. And then same thing, stitch it into a hash table. Now my buddy. All right, and I just need to request it. Now I have an access token. And same thing, same protocol, set on over. I have all my. So questions about authorization code?
So at this point, these are effectively 3 different ways in order to get either access tokens or authentication codes. We're getting tokens the whole time, but different types of tokens that do
Right.
different things.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like depending on your circumstance on how you want your script to acquire an access token. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So depending upon what you need to do, you need to ask for different types of tokens.
Right. Yeah. So it's very important. This way, it's very important to understand the different grant types. Right.
Okay. So, but when you're trying to do things, it's in the documentation which one you're going to need for this action. If you're trying to do, like you said, sending emails, you need this type of tokens, so grant types. And if you're just, hey, accessing it to, read some metadata, then you need this type of token. And then in this case, the authorization tokens, there needs to be a URL because it's trying to do like an SSO kind of thing. Is that what the redirects?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So first you open up to this URL, right? And I just have Internet Explorer open it. Then you supply it with your tenant ID, your client ID, the redirect URI, your scope, which is like I said, the permissions that you would need. It's like, hey, I need
So
these
do you
permissions.
need to send it to Google, or is it that's just anything? Can you put in nothing?
It's just my example. My redirect URI is Google. So
But does it have to be there?
It doesn't have to be. It's pretty much like anything you want, as long as it does not spit out a 404 error.
Okay.
401. Or a lot of times people just do localhost. Right? But the thing is, yeah. And then prompt. So they would prompt you. Right. So, all right, cool. I think I'm fine with this now. But your boss tells you like, oh, you need to deploy that into a Linux machine. It's headless. Now, how are you gonna re-authenticate on a Linux machine, right? When you only have PuTTY as your access to it, right? So, what comes into play next is device code, right? So, the way how it works with device code is you send an API request to the device code endpoint, which is this URL over here, and then it gives you the reply that, hey, go to microsoft.com/device login, and then input this code, right? So from there, you can pretty much go to like any browser, your phone, whatever, and then put the code, and then once you authenticate, and then you put in the valid code that you got from your script or from the response, it authenticates to the background, and then once it authenticates the background, it just something happens behind the curtains and change the status of that device code, and then once you request a token, if everything's good, it gives you an access token, right? So I'm not sure if anyone have used Azure CLI. It's the same grant type they use, right? So if see here, if you do AZ login, look at that. It talks to that, and then I need to authenticate, all right? Or oops, now it killed my AZ login. What was that? It's use device code. All right, it should give me a response in a bit. There you go. So hey, go to Microsoft.com and you just pretend like this is a headless machine, right? And then enter this code. So to demonstrate that in my code, see here. So I still have the same information, and then I get the client ID and scope, and then look at this. I'm sending it into this URL, right? Oh, I need to. Is trying to authenticate to AZCLI. All right, so I got that. Request, and then if you're curious, like, okay, what's the result of that request over there?
So is there anything
There.
unique about like one token over the other, or is all that information really in the deck? Is it something kind of like a high level, hey, these type of things are happening here, these types of stuff, or is it it's the same kind of authentication? It's just a matter of using the docs to figure out which one you need.
Right. At this point, the access tokens are similar. Yeah, because right now, I'm pretty much like using same scope, so the access tokens are pretty much going to be the same in terms of context. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yep. Good.
Okay. Yeah. Because like right now, the difference is just like how we are acquiring the access token. So so after I send my initial request to this guy, it tells me that hey, to sign in, pretty much the same thing as what we did in the AZ login or Azure login CLI, and sign in, use a browser, go to Microsoft, and then input this guy. Right. And then before I do that, let me try to request. Okay, let me try to request without having to authenticate first. Or let me try to request a token. So I get an error. Authorization is pending. So in your code, you can probably just go for like a while loop and just constantly checks probably every second until you authenticate the background. So hold on one second here. Let me try to authenticate. All right. Hey, where'd you go? Okay, and put in my password or the code. Authenticate. Now you're authenticated. So going back to my code or to my PowerShell script, if I request, now it gives me an access token. There you go.
So really in this example, what you just showed was that, hey, you can do this authentication type where you create a device code. And
Yeah.
so effectively it's offline, it's through some other method. And so for the duration of this code is that's a valid code that you can then use in the script.
Right.
Okay.
It expires in like 900 seconds. So in my initial request, I got the device code over here, right? And then I used that to request a token over here. Yep. All right. So questions on the device code? Then let me use that token to grab all my my licenses. That works. All right. So okay, and then so I mentioned earlier that your access token is only valid for an hour, right? And then all right, what I'm gonna do now? What's gonna be happening is in my access token reply over here, I get a refresh token. So the use of the refresh and refresh tokens are valid for a very long period of time. It only gets invalid if, say, the user who requested the refresh token, say, got disabled, changed its password, or there are some changes into that account, right? How you would use your refresh token is you're gonna be using it to create or request a new access token. So then in your logic, you can do say, when you're past an hour, or let's say, if you get an error when you after past an hour, if you get an error when you try to request a new access token, you could just like use your refresh token. Yeah, and you could just like keep on reusing your access token. And then yeah, let me get that into action here. So I know I have a refresh token in my last response here.
So do certain tokens give refresh tokens and others don't?
That's a really good question. So what you would need to do for you to get a new an access token is in your scope, you add offline access.
Okay, so in the
So if
original request, you have to define that, hey, I want an offline access version of this token, and that it'll
Right.
include a refresh token for a later period of time.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, thanks for that really awesome question.
And then Robert is asking about what happens if you're using a code and the token expires underneath you. You just get an access denied, right? Is that my guess? That's my thought.
Yeah. A 4xx error. Yeah, because your access token is no longer valid. So in your code, then you could just like do error traps and like, 4xx error. Come here, fresh token. Give me a new refresh token. I'll give you a new access token. So, and this is how you do it. You just run this. So I just added my refresh token in the body of my token request, and then run this guy. now I have a new access token. And I have a new refresh token as well, right? Because in my request over here, yeah, you just pretty much get a new refresh token, and then you could use then later on. Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation about this with one of the Microsoft guys. And I was like, so can I use, my access refresh token for forever? And then, or can I just go like maybe, invalidate it or dump it every 10 days? And it was like, oh, it's up to you. As long as like your user account, the user account that doesn't expire or did not change the password, and you should be good. All right, and then same access token. I'll grab all my licenses. Yeah. So that's pretty much for the grant types. Refresh token. Questions about grant types?
No, let's see some examples.
All right. Oh wait, examples. Okay. So before we get into the examples of how you can interact more with Graph API, what I mentioned about just 3 stuff: query parameters. Query parameters is say if you wanna just filter your results or your returns. Say if you wanna go for you grab all your users, and then if you have 10,000 user environment, the way how you can filter them is through query parameters. Say you just want to go for everyone, or for all users' first name is Mike, right? And then for the paging results, so and same example, if say you request for all of the users in the environment, then you get 50,000 users, right? Graph API doesn't hand them over to you and just like one result of a query, right? After you query, just not gonna like give you all, right? Because it's just gonna be huge. The way how they would do it is, um, they send you a first batch and then second batch and a third batch, and then and I'm gonna demonstrate that in a bit. Batch processing is, say you want to send, for example, you want to go for like, oh, I want to know all of my licenses, I want to know all my users, I want to know all of my groups, right? You can't, it's just going to be so time consuming to just send them all. I mean, send them like one at a time, right? So you can do batch processing where, and like, hey, I want all these data in just one response from you guys and just one request from you. So, and again, I pretty much just copy and pasted. This is the URL. Right. Let's add in some motion over here. So I have a working example here to send a message to the team, right? So, but ignore first whatever that's in my screen right now and just pay attention to the URL over here. If you notice, the URL to send a message to Teams is the base URL, and then Teams, and then the team ID, and then channel, and then channel ID, right? And then messages. So how do I know my team ID, right? Or how do I know what's my channel ID? I only know this display name, right? So what I'm gonna do is, here I'm demonstrating filtering through your URL. So I go for all of my groups, right? And then filter whose display name is equals to, say, I'm going for a group name called Hikers Heaven, right? Then I'm gonna capture the ID. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Right. So my team info. There you go. I get the value here. Here. Probably better. Now these is my code, but yeah, I want to show to you what happens. See here. if I don't put a filter?
Well, effectively, this is filter left. So
I'm sorry, say that again.
this is like filter left. So give me everything and then filter at the end,
Yeah.
or
So
you can filter at the beginning.
right. So what happens here is you're doing server-side filtering, right? Because you don't want to like just grab all the groups and then do like a where object. That's so time consuming. What you're doing here is, server-side filtering.
Yep.
And this is what happens if you don't do filtering. Right. And then in my rest, volume. So I got all my users, all my groups here. So if you get 10,000 groups, then it's going to be a lot, right? Yeah. Going back. Now I got my team ID. I just same logic. I need to know my my channel ID, right? And then my channel name is Patagonia. I grab that. Now I have my channel ID. Okay. Channel ID over here. And then for you to send to teams, you just, like I mentioned earlier, okay, what's going to be, how do I format my message, right? And you just go to Graph API, the documentation, and it's going to tell you, okay, here's how you would, format your body. You need to have a, in your JSON data, you need to have, this property name, and then your value, and then, body is going to be, the content of your body is going to be like pretty much like this. And then I do that, and see if that works. There you go. So now I'm able to send a message to Teams and see if that works. Go. And if I go to Teams, oh, okay.
Do you know if there's any
Features.
information about throttling of how many requests you can pull?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I don't know what the exact number is. But I've been into that situation, and I just add a wait time to it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So that's to demonstrate the filters, and then so yeah, for the paging, going back to my Internet Explorer over here. So I got a folder in my OneDrive, and it's got about 99. Oh man, yeah, I got 999 items over here. Then so say for example, I want to have a script that just returns all those files, and then I'm going to show you what happens. So this is what happens. Let me just run and shade all these variables. Then, so here I'm going to go for users, and then the username, and then the drive, and then the root of the drive, and then the folder, and then the children inside that folder. Okay. So what's in the result? All right. Oh, look at that. So because I have a ton of items over there, it presents me, a property in my result called data next link, right? Because and then what you're gonna do is same process with your header. You just need to access the data next link URL, because the data next link here is it's a URL. So, and then what happens if, say, if you don't have a ton of data in there, say it's just comfortable of, it's just comfortable of like putting all your results into just one response. So I changed my folder name here because I have another folder that's smaller in size. My data, which is only has one item. Then we run that. I think I already did. Then look at that. So in my result, yeah, I don't have that next data link anymore. So yeah, and then ooh.
So while you're working through that, there's a couple of questions that have been popping up in the chat that some of them have been answered, but just to get everybody on the same page, some people are wondering about wondering about the amount of access requests that could be made against services in a time period. And it looks like it varies per service. Like the rates of requests for teams is different than the rates of requests for individual apps. So do you have any history or experience with rate limiting that you might want to share with anybody, or
Like how many requests can you do at a time?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have the number, unfortunately. But yeah, but I could get back to you regarding that.
Yeah.
What's like the throttling limit, or like what's the threshold? What's the hard number?
According to this, it looks like it might be a max of 4 requests a second per app. Yeah, but so important information to pay attention to when you're pulling data, right? This Microsoft's going to protect their service, so you just don't flood it.
Yeah. It actually, in your request, if it's you're being throttled, you actually get like a very specific message. Yeah, and what I did in the past is if I get that message, then I just put another wait time, and I send my request again. Yeah.
Okay. What else we got? Because we're running up against time.
Oh yeah, just wrapping up here. So that's to demonstrate. Yeah, and then last but not least example here, it's sending requests in bulk, right? Prevent being throttled. In my body, I specify I got multiple requests, and I specify it with an ID, and then my method, and then the URL. You don't have to put in there here the base URL, and ID number 2, and then get, then groups, same thing, and then you throw it over to GotherMicrosoft.com/batch, and then let's see what happens here. Now in my result, I got all the data that I specified in my batch body. If I do here, so now I just do it like a where object where ID is equals to 1. So that tells me that, okay, these are all my users. And if I do that, or my users.
I think that's an interesting thing because you can get a bunch of data and then you can parse it after the fact, as
Right.
opposed to 3 different requests. You can get a bunch of pieces.
Yep. And then you just filter it locally. Okay, so one last thing. The PowerShell Graph SDK, it's currently still in preview, and I think it only supports the device login grant type, so you don't have a bit of a flexibility there, but it's very useful. I've used it a couple of times. If you don't want to go through like the decision making of like what with grant types, you can use this. There's about 3,200 commands currently, and yeah, it's awesome. And well, questions?
Uh-huh.
All right. So first of all, thank you for the presentation this evening. Appreciate that very much. So a couple things. So there are some questions here. We'll open up the mics if anybody want to chat. Before we get into the questions, I want to say we saw a lot of deep examples of different ways that you can access data using different authentication tokens. Jocel, where do you think is a good place for someone to start if they've never played with this stuff? Like, what kind of methods should they be using to access, like before they get to using expiring codes, and how do they get their feet wet with the basics so they can start to get the stuff that you were doing?
So when I started this thing, I just went to the graph, the overview graph, and just kind of like poke around all the documentations in there, and then, well, this might be like an opinionated answer and subjective, but the documentations are a little developer centric, but they're pretty they're pretty good in terms of like putting a lot of details in a documentation, right? That's a really good way to start. And then there is a blog as well, like a blog site that it's a Microsoft blog site that's just filled with a ton of examples for graph. That's a good start. And then for motivation, with the numbers that I showed to you, yeah, I feel like it's just a really huge plus to like know graph, because like I said, the examples that I showed earlier, those were like super basic, and that's just to like demonstrate to you, right? But what you really can do with it is just endless. There's a ton amount of information out there that you could automate with graph.
So try to do this on a regular basis so that you become comfortable with the concepts and the methods that you use to connect.
Yeah.
And then it becomes easier to sort of ingest the beast.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And like I said, I would say majority of the hurdles are like just within the authentication, getting the right access token, and once you're past through that hurdle, it's super easy. Yeah.
Okay. So earlier, there was a question, I think from David Bird, which might have been answered in the chat, but it's a pretty good topic for a question. Pros and cons versus client secrets versus certificates. You have any thoughts on that?
So I mean, if for the certificates, it's the most always secured way. It's always has the cons, all the pros. But in terms of like using it, I have not personally used it. Yeah, I've just been like using secrets and just encrypt them.
So client secrets have to be generated though, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's really the big thing. You're gonna have to generate those secrets. Certificates can be part of an automated process. You can request certificates on the fly. You can use that certificate for some hardened authentication. Whereas secrets, you're gonna have to go and generate those, and they can vary based on how good the secret is.
Yeah, I think the answer to that's like pretty generic. I mean, certificates are like proven to be like almost the secured way for like all transactions or interactions.
So I had another one too, which was going all the way back to the very, very beginning. When you're using your own personal subscription, of course, you'll have no trouble making an application registration, but a normal user can't do that. It will take not a global admin, but at least somebody who's got application administrator on the tenant in Azure Active Directory to be able to create the app registration. So anybody that's looking to do this in their production environment, or if you have a test environment from work, you're going to have to go talk to probably identity administrators,
Right.
and get them to generate the app registration for you. Because I'm not sure if that was conveyed or not in the beginning of it.
That's kind of why I was asking if you could do it with the Microsoft Teams free version. If you could hook that up with your free Azure portal subscription to get a way of testing with the Graph API.
You could, but you again, it all has to tie back to a Azure Active Directory tenant.
Right.
So you wouldn't be able to do it with like a normal Microsoft account. You'd have to be able to have a
Right.
work or full account.
So do people actually have Azure test tenants?
Depends on the organization, but
Yes.
usually, yeah.
Because testing in production usually doesn't work out well eventually.
In my previous job, we had a production Office 365 tenant and a test Office 365 tenant. And we would deploy the test first, submit change to the cab, and then deploy to production.
Yeah.
But it costs money. So there's a bunch of places that don't do that.
Yeah, except
You gotta
taking
buy
down your
2
production
tenants.
environment costs more.
Absolutely. But
So
Yeah, but
you know.
you get a free Azure account that you can have some things in, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. If you just go make one, you're good to go. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'll let you handle it yourself.
No. It's those are really good responses. I was gonna ask as well. I was gonna add as well that in some MSPs or like depending on your partnership with Microsoft, you get a free test tenant, and then I think Microsoft gives you like just like an amount allocation for a year. So, and then it's not gonna hurt to just register for a free trial account. You get $200. It's
Yeah.
consumable for a year.
It's something like, I think the MSDN license or something gives you like 10 of them or something like that.
Yeah. Because you don't have to have the premium Active Directory license here, or Azure Active Directory license. You don't have to have the premium one. The free ones works fine. Yep.
Well, thanks, Jocel. This was pretty cool. Any other questions? Ton of information there, and So, do you have any links that we want to share, or things else like that? Certainly
Absolutely.
want to maybe reference back to the overview doc that you showed originally. I don't know if that was posted in the links or something, but I want to
Yep.
certainly look at that some more.
So, yeah, I will post all of my those codes in my GitHub, and I'll send it over to you guys.